does this look?
That looks great. I think you want to go. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thanks everybody for your patience. So much technology converging here. Okay, so again, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. We are here to talk about a book that will be published very soon called Ethics in Linked Data. It's coming out from Litwin Books and Library Juice Press. So yeah, let's take us to the next slide. Okay, so our plan for this hour is to give you a brief introduction to the book, and then spend most of our time hearing from some of our chapter authors of this edited collection. Then we'll spend the last bit of our time together with Q&A and discussion. So please put your questions in the Slack, and we will look forward to that discussion. Okay, next slide, and I think that's over to you, Bree.
It is, thank you. Just to give an idea of the book in general, an overview. In putting together the book, we aim to explore the consideration and sometimes the lack thereof of ethics in linked data initiatives. So we try to engage in critical and ethical analysis, really coming from an optimistic point, saying if you're still engaged with thinking through the problems of this, you're really coming at this with an optimistic point, even if we're trying to expose problematic issues and structural problems and inequities. Part of the book was aimed to generate best practices, is partially aimed to open up these conversations and look at the implications and the possibilities for linked data in galleries, archives, library museums, and special collections. The central premise of the book was that it's possible to foreground ethics rather than apply them as an afterthought, to acknowledge and mitigate the damage caused by existing systems, to create place and space of justice for the minoritized, and to enable more ethical outcomes in linked data projects. And this book grew out specifically out of an LD4 conference, and specifically out of the Ethics Affinity Group, which was founded at a conference many, many moons ago. The three co-editors of the book, Alex, Kat, and I, were longtime members of the Affinity Group. And the book grew out of the discussions that we had over those years. And we found a home for those discussions at Library Juice Press's series on critical information, which is co-edited by Violet Fox and Kelsey George. If you have an idea for a book, pitch them. They are great. They're so wonderful to work with. And we're expecting publication on the 17th. I mean, fingers crossed, but it does look like they're finally coming out on the 17th. Just give you a general idea, it's 15 chapters, almost 500 pages. If you want to learn more about the checklist that's mentioned up here on this slide, you can look at last year's LD4 conference where we kind of went through the checklist and how you can use it for your own projects. But generally, there are three thematic sections, and we'll be hearing from authors in all three sections today. The first one is theories, context, and infrastructures, which is largely focusing on the historical and the present context for where are we now, what's the context of it, what's the histories of it. And then the second section, which is titled Ethical Considerations in the Face of Hegemonic and Institutional Forces. Long title, but it's looking at how individuals, organizations, projects grapple with those ethical concerns, grapple with colonialism, grapple with racism, systemicity, and other forces, and what they do. And many of these chapters have really profound and insightful ways that could inform your own projects. Finally, the third final part is about the context, people and communities of these forces, how they're affected, what things they've chosen to do, and how people have interacted with linked data projects. So with that all done, I will go ahead and hand it over to Dorothea and Ruth.
Yeah, so I will just
thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bree. When we go to new speakers, I'll just say their names and turn it over to them. So yeah, take it away, Dorothea and Ruth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dorothea and I focus in our chapter on the ethics of infrastructures. So linked data projects build off of other linked data projects. It's what allows the field to grow, but it means that so many of the things we work with are interdependent. So the disappearance of a vocabulary, the abandonment of a technology, or the lack of content maintenance and updates in a knowledge base are going to have ripple effects throughout the system. We start with 3 case studies. First, how OCLC's decision not to maintain Perl.org temporarily harmed the Bebo ontology. Second, how DBpedia's pause of data updates created misleading data for anyone who was relying on it and not aware of this pause. And third, how the open metadata registry fell apart due to lack of post-grant maintenance. We then discussed crowdsourcing and some of the challenges to keep that going and to make it inclusive. So I'm going to talk very briefly today about one of the case studies, DBpedia. In examining the infrastructure, we start with an overview of the data creation process, which required significant time and labor. This meant that what was published was often about 6 months out of date. We then discussed the freeze, which occurred from the load of October 2016 data, which was published in July 2017, through January 2021, when it started updating again. And as all of us who have just got done living through that period know, between October 2016 and January 2021, there were a lot of contested truth claims. Not having access to timely data is not a big deal when it's about, say, a 1982 music album. It's maybe a little embarrassing if our system takes 6 months to realize that an artist has now died. But if it furthers something like the myth of a stolen election, that becomes dangerous. Now, this wasn't because of an ill intention on DBpedia's part. They were dealing with a significant technical challenge and communicating about the pause and other things. But anyone who was running a DBpedia integration or using their data on autopilot could have caused confusion or harm. So what should people do? We conclude the chapter with recommendations for project design, both new projects and those which rely on other linked data projects, for funders who are sponsoring such work, and for crowdsourcing. So, for example, have you created maintenance, transfer, and sunsetting plans for some new project you're starting? Or if you're a funder looking at such a project, what are you requiring? We believe that project rot doesn't have to happen, and we hope you'll join us in preventing it. The entire linked data enterprise will be stronger if we approach project maintenance and sunsetting transparently and ethically. And I hope you enjoy our chapter.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Dorothea. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, Bree. Next up, we'll hear from Danielle Metilli and Chiara Paolini about their chapter, Non-Binary Gender Representation in Wikidata. And please just tell Bree when to advance to the next slide.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank the editors because this has been an important step for us in our Wikidata Gender Diversity project. This is a preliminary study about non-binary gender and how it is represented in Wikidata. Next slide, please. So our project is now a one-year project funded through the Wikimedia Research Fund. It was funded after we initially submitted the chapter, and we are looking at gender diversity in Wikidata following a critical approach, focusing on marginalized gender identities from a queer and intersectional feminist perspective. Next slide, please. The motivation behind this work and this research is that those identities that fall outside the gender binary suffer discrimination and systematic erasure in society, and this impacts any kind of gender diversity or sexual diversity, including trans people, non-binary people, intersex people, but in general, anyone who does not conform to the traditional Western view of gender. So we set up this project. We are now a team of 4 people. The project has also been extended until the end of this year. Now I'm leaving the floor to my co-host, Chiara Paolini.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So we approached this big question, this big topic, by using 3 perspectives. We first looked at the Wikidata ontology and how gender is modeled. And then we looked at the representation, the statistical representation of gender data in the knowledge base. And then we did a more linguistic analysis by looking at the discussion that the user of Wikidata did about gender, so in the Wikidata community. And next slide, please.
Chiara, your audio is breaking up quite a bit. I wonder if you might turn off your video or try a different headset.
Do you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So I think you can, like with the slide, you can go by 3. So it's 1, 2, 3. If you click a couple of times, yes, thank you. So what we present in our our outcomes, our general outcomes is to build a complete timeline of the gender modeling in Wikidata, to have a very broad narrative of how gender is discussed and modeled in the ontology. But what we presented in the chapter, so what you will find out is are accurate statistics about gender identities in Wikidata and a corpus analysis of the discussions about gender. So how users, since we don't have data about the users, we analyze the discussion to see how they approach gender identities and how they modeled the mostly marginalized gender identities, and more specifically non-binary and trans identities. So I hope you're gonna enjoy our chapter and the entire book, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to hear from Ryan Shaw about who gets to decide which problems need solving, a dispute over the value of semantically enhanced HTML. Take it away, Ryan.
All right, thank you. Thanks a lot to the editors for getting this book off the ground, because I don't know where else I would have published this chapter, which was an opportunity for me to revisit something that made a big impression on me when I first saw it, which was a mailing list discussion that went on for about a period of a year at the World Wide Web Consortium and the WHAT working group that develops the HTML standard, about developing a standard for embedding linked data in HTML pages. And what struck me about it was that what on the face of it seemed like a very technical issue that would just hash out how are we going to encode these data structures in HTML, took on these very moral overtones, that this debate, this discussion, this argument that went on for the period of a year seemed to me to have very little technical content and a lot of moral content that expressed competing value systems. And I remember that making a big impression on me at the time, late 2008, late 2009, when I first saw this. And I wanted to return to those archives and try to understand what was going on for this chapter with the help of some sociological theory, looking at how people express their kind of values when there's a dispute over values. So in some cases, people have shared values and there's just a dispute over how do we enact these values. But in other cases, the values themselves are what are under dispute. And I felt like that was a good lens for understanding what was going on with these people who were arguing for and against linked data. What I hope people might get out of this chapter is reflecting on when people are kind of advocating for something like linked data, what are some of the assumptions behind what we see as positive about linked data? So things like decentralization and collaboration and not having to go through gatekeepers and things like that. These are often the kinds of things that come up when you hear somebody advocating for linked data. But those placing values on those things is not so easily separated from the technical discussions themselves, and it's something that we kind of easily overlook. So I'm hoping that people one, find it interesting as a sort of historical account, and then also maybe prompt people to think about whether the values that are inherent in linked data really do line up with the projects that people are thinking about using linked data to implement. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about it. But that's kind of the 10,000-foot overview. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next up, we will hear from Erin Canning on ethical considerations in the development of a responsible linked open data infrastructure. Take it away, Erin.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, I'm Erin. I'm formerly the ontology systems analyst at Lynx. I'm now a PhD student. And so I'm presenting on behalf of my coworkers or co-authors and until recently coworkers, Susan Brown, Kimberly Martin, and Sarah Roger about work that we did as part of the Lynx project. Our chapter, The Ethical Considerations in the Development of Responsible Linked Open Data Infrastructure, describes some of the decision-making processes and resulting policies that we developed at Lynx as we tackled questions of how to approach the development of linked open data infrastructure in ways that reflected the core values of the project. So Lynx, which stands for the Linked Infrastructure for Networked Cultural Scholarship Project, is a Canadian linked open data cyber infrastructure development project funded by the Canada Foundation for Innovation. The goal of the project is to develop technical frameworks and tools to support the creation, publication, and exploration of linked open data, and to convert data sets from humanities researchers into linked open data for further cultural research. So Lynx data comes from mobilizing data sets brought to Lynx by researchers who we then collaborate with to map, transform, and publish as linked data. As a result, Lynx data sets vary considerably in size, format, domain, and content. Because Lynx is an infrastructure development project, the focus of our chapter in this book was on the decisions around developing infrastructure and mobilizing data sets, as opposed to ethical considerations around any one data set or domain of data in particular. Instead, the ethical considerations we discuss revolve around this concept of replatforming, by which we mean the recirculating of existing data through a new platform that provides different affordances, namely in this case as linked data. This concept of replatforming is intended to point to data's prior life on other platforms, the affordances that platforms can provide for addressing historical under or misrepresentation by amplifying or reframing data, and the need for critical analysis of the implications of providing a new platform for existing data. The Lynx platform disseminates linked open data extracted from existing research outputs previously covered by the ethics policies of universities and funders. However, converting existing data sets and publishing associated metadata as linked open data generates greater findability and deeper connectivity to other research than would have been necessarily considered during researchers' initial ethics clearance processes. Furthermore, the nature of linked data compounds the risks of publishing content in ways that make it accessible in context when it was not originally anticipated. We therefore recognize that Lynx introduces risks as well as provides benefits. In this chapter of this book, we discuss our approaches to mitigating these risks in sort of three main ethical areas. The first of these is in regards to how the Lynx team collaborates with researchers. In this chapter, we discuss three concerns and changes that we made as a result of ethical considerations that arose in working with researchers regarding the development and evolution of areas of inquiry within the project, the prioritization of data sets for ingestion into Lynx, and considerations around connecting these data sets both to each other and to the larger web of linked data. The second area of consideration covers ethical concerns associated with the ontologies and vocabularies used to replatform research data as linked open data. So in this section, we describe the development of the Lynx Ontologies Adoption and Development Policy, which is a policy document that describes how Lynx project values can be put into practice when considering how to mobilize data as linked open data. One note of this is that a key part of the document is a table of aspirational metrics and the structural problems they're intended to address, inspired by a similar table in D'Ignazio and Klein's book, Data Feminism. Creating this table of concerns and goals, as well as creating the policy document as a whole, provided us an opportunity to think through approaches to issues that the project was likely to encounter before things really got off the ground. And then the third and final area of consideration in this chapter is the project's data publication license agreement, which is designed to promote ethical choices with respect to ethics clearance, credit, and licensing. As a legal agreement, the data publication license somewhat struggles to capture the spirit of collaboration that's at the core of links. So in response, we tried to sort of go with an approach that fostered mutual understanding. So the body of the agreement has two columns, where the left states the principles in accessible language, and then the right hand lists the provisions and like the legalese required by the document. Like with the ontology's adoption and development policy, the links team didn't come up with the ideas for this document all on our own, but rather built on policies of related projects by which we're inspired, including the interdisciplinary project charter template made by Stan Rucker and Milena Redzakowska, the DANS license agreement, the Daria model deposit license, and the Quirk data donation license agreement. So describing these three areas, we hope to give readers an idea about some of the ethical considerations involved in building linked open data infrastructure and replatforming existing data sets, and in this way speak to the unique place that links sits within the broader linked open data ecosystem. And that's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we're ready for the next slide. Thanks, Bree. Next up, we will hear from Moritz Strickert about the chapter Ethnological Vocabularies and GND's Authority Files, Ethical Issues and Practical Approaches. Take it away, Moritz.
Thanks. So, hi, everyone. I'm presenting my chapter as part of my work for the Specialized Information Service for Cultural and Social Anthropology. This is an institution which supports researchers in the field of social and cultural anthropology by providing information resources and research access. And in addition, we deal with infrastructural issues at the intersection to research and support discussion and positioning processes in the ethnological disciplines. One project deals with vocabularies and authority files. My project. The aim of the project is broad updating of subject headings and personal data records of the ethnological sciences on the basis of scientific needs regarding the integrated authority file. In German, Gemeinsame Normdatei or GND, which is the central authority file in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And in this work, ethical considerations are quite important while doing it. For example, the question, what perspectives are included, which are left out, who determines what may be shown and in which way, and who gets to have a say. Next slide, please. So the work on the datasets includes problematic and outdated terms. So there's a tension between foreign and self-designations of groups, and at the same time, the need to search for suitable and generic terms. There's a lack of numerous important terms for the ethnological disciplines, and links for dense network structure are partly missing, for example, in the form of connecting intermediate terms. And regarding data sets for persons, where persons partly are not existing, or the entries are only containing little information. Next slide, please. I'm also part of the network Colonial Context, which is a big network of around about 60 institutions in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The network addresses issues of digital aggregation, editing, and visibility, as well as accessibility and uses of digital materials and data from colonial context. And not only national actors are important, but also international context should be brought into conversation with each other within this network. The network aims at a better coordination and networking of projects in the various fields or different GLAM institutions, avoiding isolated solutions and ensuring sustainability. Within the network, a working group on controlled vocabularies has been established, and its aim is to collect and link various vocabularies and to relate them to more comprehensive vocabularies, in particularly the integrated authority file, GND. In the course of the working group, the idea arose to develop an exemplary vocabulary for cultural groups based on the GND on the one hand, and vocabularies, for example, from other institutions on the other hand. These vocabularies are often not standardized, project-related, or only available for a limited period of time. So the working group obtains at the moment an overview of already existing controlled vocabularies, whose networking, harmonization, and critical reflection is aimed at. So in the GND, there are about 4,000 records regarding cultural groups, which form the basis of our work. And right now we are currently in the process of making initial comparisons between different vocabularies, compiling these vocabularies, searching for experts or people with expertise on certain fields or areas, and gradually developing a workflow. So this was my short introduction. Thanks for your attention, and thanks to the publishers.
Thank you so much. Next up, we will hear from Peggy Griesinger and Hannah Bertoldi about their chapter, also written with Michaela Narlock. All we want are the facts, ma'am, negotiating user needs and creator privacy in name authority records. Go for it. Take it away.
All right. So we were inspired to name our chapter after a famous catchphrase in the TV show Dragnet. In the show, a police detective character named Joe Friday is associated with the catchphrase, "All we want are the facts, ma'am." By this, he means only the facts are important for solving police cases, and women in particular must have this explained to them. We found Friday's catchphrase particularly relevant when researching our chapter about the ethical concerns about creating authority records for creators. Following best practices for creating authority records, Following best practices for creating authority records for creators, library and museum catalogers, who are disproportionately women, are confronted with recording biographical metadata as objective fact. However, the cataloging profession is beginning to accept that recording the world involves some degree of uncertainty and bias. Despite this, online catalogs and related technologies haven't been changed to accommodate these new approaches. Our chapter uses the development of a digital collections platform at a university as a framework for exploring how this metadata is recorded. During the development of this platform, extensive user testing revealed frequent requests for additional information about content creators. This is what inspired us to take a deep dive into the ethical use of name authority records. While a linked data solution could be deployed to enhance personal information, we questioned the ethical implications of describing living creators. So one of the issues that we talked about was that identities are inconsistently recorded depending on whether a person is a member of a dominant cultural identity or not. So whether or not they're white, straight, Christian, male, cisgender, and other identities that are considered the norm in Western culture. It's not accurate or fair to only describe people when they deviate from the norm. Another issue is one of consent and documentation, especially as it relates to privacy. So, personally identifiable information could be included that the author doesn't want publicized. If we agree that the ethical way to catalog living people is to ask for their consent before recording aspects of their identity, how do we know that the linked data we're using actually had that consent? The problem is that in most cases we don't. We want creator consent to be explicitly stated in the record before using linked open data to enhance our own data. So a couple of our recommendations for addressing these issues. We advocate for greater transparency in how NARs are created for living people. If biographical information is gathered with consent from a living creator and that can be clearly identified in LOD, it could save cultural institutions from having to do that work all over again themselves. They would know that they could ethically use that metadata. Additionally, online collections need to be better at explaining to their users how their information is created and sourced. The way this information is currently presented leads users to confuse interpretation with fact. And this misrepresentation can have devastating repercussions for living people, since the digital space memorializes the choices that catalogers make. We should proceed more slowly when recording information, consider the long and short-term impact of the work we do, and explain this thoroughly to living creators in order to get their informed consent. The second structure that affects the ethics of NAR creation is the work culture of libraries and museums. So the short timelines, the huge backlogs, and the limited and inconsistent labor. These constraints negatively impact ethical cataloging work because they suppress the environment necessary for reflexive thinking. Cultural institutions need to invest in professional staff who have experience and they have time to catalog in a holistic way that includes robust relationship building with creators. That means reducing the number of temporary staff, including students, and supporting full-time positions for people who receive proper training and have the time to create ethical NARs. I'm running out of time here, so let me just run through a few more of these. Cataloging work, ironically, as I rush through this, cataloging work should slow down so that trusted relationships can be formed with the creators whose work cultural institutions are working to make accessible. Finally, how museums and libraries manage access to their collection affects how personally identifying information is used. Access to collection items is mediated through technology, and we need to work harder at exposing the labor involved in cataloging. We must address the fact that online collections are not, by their very nature, democratizing. Rather, they require thoughtful attention and effort to present metadata marking minoritized identities and exposing previously hidden objects. Having ethically sourced metadata about living artists' minoritized identities will create a better data set for museums and libraries to promote culturally diverse works and fulfill user needs. Of course, there is a balance in providing an appropriate level of information. Some communities may wish to remain invisible, while others may want to be named, and that should be discussed and evaluated alongside communities and not on their behalf. I think that was exactly 5 minutes, so okay, that's all from me.
It was. Thank you. Great. So next up, we will be hearing about the chapter Oklahoma Native Artists Project, Oral Histories to Link Data. And we'll hear from Megan Mackin now. Take it away, Megan.
Hello. All right, I'm Megan Mackin. I co-authored the chapter with oral historians Julie Pearson Little Thunder and Sarah Milligan, and former metadata librarian Madison Chartier at Oklahoma State University Libraries, where I'm the assistant head of digital resources and discovery services. Could you go to the next slide, please? Our case study explores the process of translating information documented about living people through oral histories into linked open data. So this was our first foray into linked open data at OSU. The oral history series we focused on, the Oklahoma Native Artists Project, documents and shares with the public the history and culture of Native artists with an Oklahoma connection. The Oklahoma part is significant because the state is home to 39 federally recognized tribal nations. And the 141 oral history interviewees include enrolled citizens of tribal nations and artists of self-identified Indigenous ancestry, as well as festival and exhibition organizers, gallery owners, and collectors. The interviews were conducted by Dr. Pearson Little Thunder, and they cover artists' family and tribal backgrounds, schooling, business strategies, shows and awards, creative processes, subject matter, and techniques. Next slide, please. Linked open data, especially Wikidata, is an exciting way to improve the discoverability of library collections like this that represent marginalized groups. And as we began exploring linked open data for Indigenous artists, we had more questions than answers. Can libraries increase visibility for these living artists while still respecting their priorities, privacy, and self-representation? Is it possible to create linked open data that recognizes Native American artists as citizens of sovereign nations with unique cultural histories and as active participants in the international contemporary art scene? And another question we borrowed from art scholars Ash Milby and Phillips: on whose terms should inclusion take place? So for guidance, we look to established ethics for oral history work, the Oral History or OHA's Principles and Best Practices for Oral History, and ethics for data sovereignty, the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance, to help maintain the respectful approach of the original Oral History Project without oversimplification as much as possible. The OHA principles and best practices state that the interview process must be transparent with ongoing participation, consent, and engagement among all parties from the first encounter between interviewer and narrator to the creation of end products. And at Oklahoma State, creating linked open data is one of the end products of the interview process. And so we committed to securing artists' permission for creating linked open data about them. So our chapter walks through our process for communicating with artists, securing permission, and creating linked open data to ensure the project's alignment with these guidelines. Next slide, please. Securing permissions is a time-consuming process, but it is important for this specific oral history series for several reasons. Wikidata would take native artists' information from the local sphere of our library website, it's kind of buried, hard to find, to a prominent public place, such as a Google Knowledge panel. Linked open data is also easier to share and repurpose, which can be good or problematic. Relationships and other details that artists don't want to broadcast could become highly publicized. And linked open data can only hint at the abundance of context in the oral history interviews. Oral history is certainly not blameless, of course, but the interviewees at least do have a platform for their own voices in oral history. But in most linked open data, it's not the case unless they create the data themselves. So this context is particularly important for Native artists who present their identity differently, depending on their audience, whether an institution such as library or museum, the public they encounter at art fairs or festivals, or their own communities. So these nuances risk misrepresentation in the worst case, and in the process of translating information from an oral history into standardized data about the artist and their artwork, it's possible. Linked open data is generally not a familiar topic for many people outside of libraries, so clear communication is vital to ensure that the artists understand the project, its benefits and risks before they consent to have the library create linked open data about them. And so it's important to make that connection with the artists and continue that relationship in order to have an ethical use of linked open data. All right, so next slide, please. Thanks for your time today. And I would appreciate your questions and comments if you'd like to get in touch. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Next up, we will hear from Dr. Stacey Allison Casson on the chapter Wikidata, Linked Data, and Cognitive Justice, an exploration of Indigenous peoplehood, nationhood, and sovereignty. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So hello, everybody. I want to add my additional thanks to the editors, all my co-authors for the book, and to Litwin Press as well. So this chapter comes out of ongoing work, and as I was preparing for this conversation today, I was recalling that presented on a similar topic way back in 2019 at the LD4 conference in Boston. I think maybe some of you were there, and that presentation was about work that we had been doing coming out of a joint working group of the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, Indigenous Matters Group, and the National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Alliance, NICLA, on creating the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous ontology, which had its initial draft launch in June of 2019. And we had, I've been working with Dean Seaman on a Wikibase sort of test instance. So as we were going about that work, the ontology involved creating vocabularies for Indigenous peoples, languages, and cultures that is presented as an alternative to Library of Congress terms. I think many of you are probably familiar with the sort of ongoing issues with Library of Congress, certainly in that ethical context. And while it's great news to see the Library of Congress making significant, recent significant changes, or at least openness to change of those terms, it's important to think about the considerations of having Indigenous owned or Indigenous led ontologies. So I'll put in a link in the Slack to some more recent work. So this chapter comes from some conversations that sort of rooted in that work around the Métis Nation. So I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Actually, I would refer to myself as a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, which is a specific recognized Indigenous community in Canada. In the United States, you might think of that as being an enrolled member or federally recognized member. And as we were going about this work, I was tasked with trying to come up with terms for the Métis people. Where are they? Locations. And it was really hard. It was conceptually difficult because Métis Nation is traditionally mobile. We're only recognized federally relatively recently, and doesn't have necessarily clear geographic boundaries like many First Nations communities. And so dealing with some of these conceptual difficulties caused me to really think about what does it mean to engage in linked data in an ethical way, not only for the names that we refer to people by, so often that's sort of what we think about when we talk about naming and terminology, but actually the sort of political and considerations of what those terms are linked to. How do we consider those terms? So this chapter is looking at these connections between ideas of nationhood and sort of the political aspirations of Indigenous peoples, and some ethical considerations in terms of linked data. So how are we looking at some of those same as relationships? What does it mean to model data in a particular way? Where do things sit in a hierarchy? And so I looked at Wikidata in relation to this. And so if we flip to the next slide, in Wikidata, most Indigenous nations are actually considered ethnic groups. So I used Wikidata as my sort of way of talking about this issue of sovereignty and political aspirations. And what, just very briefly, one of the problems is, of course, with ethnic group, as you see here, it's different from nation. So it does not have the same sort of political implications as a nation. And the previous speaker was just talking about the care principles, and we can look to things like Indigenous data sovereignty, or talking about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the connection between Indigenous nationhood and something like UNDRIP, and what that means for our data connectivity. So my chapter goes into this in more detail, which I do not have time to do today. So using Wikidata as a way to sort of talk through these different challenges. And we can flip to the next slide. And see here what we mean by nation. So we still have some of the same ideas of ethnicity, but we see this link again to the sort of the political aspects of indigeneity. And we can go to the next slide. So that's one piece of that conversation that's in the chapter. Another piece of the conversation is how do we make connections between linked data? So for example, from Wikidata to Library of Congress subject terms. And we see that both of these terms, and as far as the Métis Nation is concerned, is incorrect. So the Métis Nation does not simply mean a mix between First Nations or mixed blood. That's actually like really problematic. So to see these problematic terms amplified. So, and to think about, again, ethnicity and nationhood as being important expressions, but ethical practice in linked data, really thinking about how that means for Indigenous people. And I'll just end with a quote from Métis scholar Chris Anderson, who says, nations, at least in their modern sense, are not things, but political projects produced through the collective efforts of claims makers. And so to think about our responsibilities in creating and supporting and moving forward with linked data, and how that actually relates to collective governance and to adhering to some of the rights frameworks like UNDRIP. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our authors who presented today, and to our authors who didn't present today. There are also other chapters to check out in this book. So we have about 10 minutes. So I will, with Kat, moderate some Q&A. Maybe we can start with a question from the Slack. There is also quite a lot of great discussion generated by the presentation, so check that out. But John Mark Ockerbloom says, thank you to all the ethics authors. I'm looking forward to reading more about ways to manage and keep information on consent to distribute personal information. I know of some platforms that have processes for removing it on request, but the process can be quite different and non-obvious on different platforms. It's usually opt-out instead of opt-in. If any of the authors have more to say about how to make managing and keeping information on consent work well practically, they would love to hear more about that. So if anyone has thoughts on that, from our panelists or other book chapter authors who didn't present today, we welcome your insights.
Well, I can say that we've collected some consent, but we don't have a great process for it. It's just like managing documents that we keep on our drives. So nothing too exciting to share there. We also have a spreadsheet because we are contacting a set group of people systematically. So we mark off when we've contacted them and what their response was, but nothing platform specific. I think we use Google Docs for both of these things, or Google Drive.
So for our chapter, we do present some specific ways to do this. And actually, I talk a little bit about a personal experience that I had contributing to some of the Getty vocabularies. And all we suggest is actually to just cite it as a source that the person that you're cataloging has given consent, and perhaps the date and how they were contacted.
Great, thank you. And we can continue discussion on that topic in the Slack. I am also putting in a link, I will in a moment, to the ethics channel in the LD4 Slack, which is very dormant right now, but that would be awesome if we could, revive that group as well. Let's see. So other questions, I think not seeing much else happening in the chat yet, but I guess I would like to know from our authors, what insight surprised you most as you researched and wrote your chapters? Or just anything that surprised you. It doesn't have to be super insightful.
I guess I'll jump in on that. I actually hadn't, prior to working with Ruth to write our chapter, I hadn't been aware of the entire Perl.org saga. And it's actually pretty appalling that a service that many digital collections were already relying on, never mind Bibo, just, poof, gone by. Truly, truly scary and not good.
Yeah, one of the things we outline in our book is actually how well the Bibo people did by upfront minting a Perl, and how the project had to iterate and update the link several times. And what happened was they cut off access to updating links. And so suddenly when they lost control of a domain, so we actually thought, this is actually a really good example of how they had been so responsible for this. And then they put thought and care afterward into how they might handle the project in future, handed it off to DCMI because they were kind of overwhelmed by some of these external factors.
Danielle, go ahead. You have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. One thing that was surprising as we looked at the history of gender modeling in Wikidata, is the processes through which some decisions were taken, and how few people actually influenced the whole ontology in a big way at the beginning of the project. And how difficult it was later to change these initial decisions, which were based on mistaken assumptions sometimes about what gender is and how to represent it. So yeah, that I think one thing that has been fascinating and surprising is these processes through which the community has come to certain decisions and outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of your chapters delve into kind of what goes on underneath the hidden processes, and that's a really just kind of eye-opening aspect of a lot of your work.
Thank you. I also want to mention that we have another presentation tomorrow, which will be longer, and we will. The reason why we didn't put many details today and just talked about the project in general is that we will discuss the specifics tomorrow in this presentation titled "How do you model my gender?" Also, one thing that comes to mind is with regard to the topic of consent that was discussed before, is that in Wikidata, the data subjects or the people who are described have rarely any possibility to change their descriptions, or in some cases they are prevented from doing so by the rules of the project, also like in Wikipedia. So this is a significant issue.
And if I may add something, like there was this very funny, but not so funny case.
Yara, your audio is still not great. If you want to just turn your video off.
I am so sorry. I don't know why, but so there was this case in which a lot of gendered names, especially like Turkish Arabic names, they've been assigned a gender without any kind of consent. So you had a lot of people with a specific gender, of course, always binary, and people had to research and to point it out, please stop adding a gender just because this sounds female or male. So there the concept is completely go away, and people had to research about it, but it's very difficult also for communities, for specific cultural communities to enter into Wikidata and pointing out this kind of cross consent.
Well, I'll just add on the topic of Wikidata also, I was talking about the Métis initiative. I actually repeatedly edited the Métis entry in Wikidata, but it just gets changed back. So I think one thing that maybe didn't surprise me, but there's a lot of structural issues in Wikidata, probably as many of us know, and the thought of trying to again, because of the ways that they're so far down and so embedded, that to pull it back and redo it is so massive a project. I kind of wonder what to even do about some of those things. And there's also, I think, speaking to I was just looking at some of the Slack comments, the community resistance in some ways to listening and taking some of these issues seriously is also gives me pause around some of the sort of future of Wikidata in some of these places. So I wonder, maybe that's a conversation for the Wikidata conference. I don't know, but so I don't know. I looked at it, and then you sort of start to get overwhelmed by the kind of deeply ingrained issues with ontology, but also just it's the ontology plus the community that kind of causes some challenges. Definitely. Well, I think we are all out of time. So thank you so much again to all our authors and to all of you for coming. And we look forward to continuing the discussion in Slack. And yeah, order our book. It's coming out really soon, and we want to keep talking about it with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much from the company for hosting us. Adastai, the authors, and her editors. Thank you very much for discussing our book today. Well done, and do enjoy the rest of your day.